Good morning, everybody. Welcome. We're delighted to have you here. My name is John Hamry, and rare opportunity. We had this scheduled once before, but we had a snowstorm that got in the way, and we had to cancel it. It was one of Washington's typical snowstorms. You know, it was enough to close the schools, but not enough to close the roads. But anyway, so we shut down, but now we're going to make up for that. And I'm very, very pleased that Ranking Member Menendez has been willing to come back. He kept it on his calendar to share his thinking with us. There's so much going on, and the timing couldn't be more dynamic and interesting than with just the reporting of over last night. You know, here we have potentially the next Secretary of State conducting covert missions to North Korea to talk about things that have been just off the table for 60, 70 years. And, Senator, we're glad that you're willing to share these thoughts with us, your ideas. We're going to have a very exciting morning. Friends, the Senator does have to leave at 9:45, so we're going to keep the questions tight. I'm going to ask a bunch of questions. If we've got some time, I'll turn to you. But right now, let's please bring Senator Menendez to the stage with your warm welcome, please.
Well, good morning. Thank you, John, for your welcome and for inviting us back to Tasos. Good morning, everyone. Let me first share my thoughts and prayers with the Bush family. Barbara Bush was an extraordinary First Lady, and she became America's First Lady for families who just found in her someone that they could relate to. And so our thoughts and prayers are with the Bush family. I'm glad to be back at CISIS once again discussing the role of the United States in the world. We come together at a time when the principles that America has long championed across the globe, the rule of law, good governance, democratic institutions, are under assault here at home. It is in times like these that a robust civil society, including institutions like yours, are more essential than ever. That CISIS was founded amid the uncertainty of the Cold War underscores the value of bringing experts from government, defense, and academia together to develop solutions to our most confounding challenges. And indeed, as we look inward and abroad, we see extraordinary challenges, both new and old, from every corner of the world. So today I'd like to highlight some of my most immediate concerns, how I believe the Trump administration is or is not responding, and the role of Congress in promoting America's foreign policy interests and conducting effective oversight of the executive branch. We are living the Chinese curse. To say that these are interesting times is to say the least, and I would add challenging times as well. Never before in my more than 2.5 decades in Congress, where I have served on the House and Senate Foreign Relations Committee consecutively, have I been so concerned by the confluence of events at home and abroad, putting us on the precipice of a world in chaos. Make no mistake, the United States has triumphed in the face of tremendous adversity before. But what's uniquely concerning about this moment, however, is that the Trump administration does not appreciate America's role as the bulwark against a world in crisis. Instead, we see the Trump administration undermining the very values and institutions that make the United States a leader, a nation that works with our partners to build peace, stability, security, and prosperity across the globe. As we face encroaching chaos, the administration has failed its most basic duty, to use our resources to develop strategies to safeguard national security and to address the myriad crises that we confront. At Director Pompeo's confirmation hearing last week, I asked, in the face of multiple and conflicting statements from the Director on various policy issues, which Mike Pompeo am I being asked to confirm? And combined with John Bolton starting as the President's new National Security Advisor, I think that there's perhaps an even more basic question in the face of strategic chaos and whiplash of the Trump administration. Which America, what America, do we wish to be on the global stage? Most immediately, while I strongly believe the United States should lead the international community in holding Assad accountable for his brutal attacks on civilians, This past weekend's strikes against Syria do not constitute a strategy. And this crisis is not new. What started as a democratic uprising has grown into a full-fledged conflict of epic great power proportions, clearing a path for the expansion of Iran's revisionist proxy and terrorist networks, bolstered by a manipulative Vladimir Putin, creating a devastating and massive humanitarian crisis that has spilled into its neighboring regions. And of course, this failure of strategic vision has been most evident regarding Russia. Just yesterday, we saw the President reverse UN Ambassador Nikki Haley's announcement that the United States would sanction Russian entities that supported Assad's recent chemical weapons attack, with administration officials subsequently blaming Haley's, quote, momentary confusion. Well, I have been confused for more than a year. We have witnessed interference in our democratic institutions, an attack on Ukrainian sovereignty, brazen chemical attacks on foreign soil, support for a murderous regime in Syria, allowing for the expansion of Iranian terrorism, infiltrations into our energy grid and other critical infrastructure, the systematic transfer of assets to a select group of hand-picked oligarchs, someone who seems to want to be czar more than president. These activities reveal an intentional effort to sow instability using a combination of 21st century disinformation campaigns and old-fashioned military aggression. Yet the President refuses, outright refuses, to clearly and unequivocally condemn Putin's actions, including those that undermine American democracy. And while he calls a court-granted search warrant an attack on our country, he refuses to address the Russian government's attack on our democracy. To me, that's pretty inexplicable. The administration has taken limited actions targeting some of those in Putin's inner circle, but the President's equivocation and his administration's lack of comprehensive strategy to Russia is unacceptable, and it is dangerous both to the United States and our allies. Turning to Asia, it's quite a time to be alive when the President of the United States refuses to condemn Vladimir Putin, but announces on a whim that he'd be happy to meet with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. A meeting is not a strategy. An empowered, experienced, and capable diplomatic corps and intense preparation are essential to any hopes for a successful outcome of negotiations with North Korea. And I worry about a reality TV show attitude that declares we've solved this when we know that's far from the case. We all recognize that a nuclear-armed North Korea has put the Asia-Pacific region on edge, but China's rise has also created anxiety in the region. With Xi Jinping declaring himself president for life, a crackdown on civil society and human rights, and China advancing militarily in the South China Sea and economically in Africa and the Western Hemisphere, we face an evolving strategic challenge from an emboldened China. Securing America's long-term prosperity amid this competition will require creativity, strategic leadership, and bold investments in our own economic competitiveness, as well as robust support for the rules-based economy and the international order. But I think we can all agree that praising dictatorial tendencies, imposing erratic trade policies, and publicly chastising key allies like South Korea accomplishes none of those things. And in our own hemisphere, untold despair and unrest has edged Venezuela ever closer to becoming a failed state with a brewing refugee crisis of catastrophic magnitude. Clearly, the world is rife with many threats and challenges, but never before has the United States been so ill-equipped to address them. To call this administration's approach to foreign policy chaotic and incoherent does not do it justice. The absence of a coherent strategy is dangerous. As my friend Leon Panetta said, leadership in disarray cannot lead a world in disarray. For the past 15 months, the President and his top diplomats systematically gutted and demoralized the agency primarily responsible for projecting American power, American values, and American interests around the world. Of 163 senior leadership positions at the State Department requiring Senate confirmation, the administration has failed to nominate nominate candidates for 65 of them. We've seen a forced exodus of experienced diplomats and career public servants. We have just one career-level ambassador left, who the administration has shipped off to academia, and the rest of the building seems to be faring no better. And beyond the lack of nominees for high-level positions, including ambassadors to Saudi Arabia, South Korea, and Turkey, just to name a few, as well as the assistant secretaries for the Western Hemisphere and Near Eastern affairs, the misguided and erratic reorganization created a vacuum of leadership. It devastated morale, not just in the Foggy Bottom, but in posts worldwide. The President's fundamental disregard for the value of diplomacy and the mission of the State Department was most recently on display with his unceremonious dismissal of Secretary Tillerson, or reports of politically motivated firings of career civil servants, diplomats who have served both Republican and Democratic administrations alike on behalf of the American people and in pursuit of American interests. Reports which I, along with some of my colleagues in the House, have called for the Inspector General to investigate. The next Secretary of State will thus inherit an emaciated State Department with a hollowed-out diplomatic corps that is less capable of advancing our interests abroad. During his confirmation hearing last week, I was pleased to hear Director Pompeo pledge support for the mission and personnel of the department. But let's be clear, this is a minimum declaration we should expect from any secretary. More broadly, Director Pompeo did little to assuage my concern about the administration's lack of strategic vision for any of our major global challenges. When I and others repeatedly pressed him to outline specific policies to counter Syrian, Russian, and Turkish efforts in Syria, he gave me a series of goals. When I asked what the administration plan was for unilaterally withdrawing from the Iran deal and whether it was in our national security interests, he again offered a series of goals, but no strategy on how to achieve them. And while Director Pompeo was certainly constrained by the administration's own lack of vision, his own personal record is deeply troubling. Past statements indicate he has a preference for military action before exhausting diplomacy. Furthermore, he was unable to satisfactorily or express contrition for some of the more egregious statements he made as a member of Congress about Muslims, or defending his positions denying women and LGBTQ individual fundamental human rights. And finally, after committing to transparency in his opening statement, he was not forthcoming when I questioned him about his involvement in the Russia investigation. And I can tell you, even in my private conversations with me, he didn't tell me about his visit to North Korea. Now, I don't expect diplomacy to be negotiated out in the open, but I do expect for someone who is the nominee to be the Secretary of State, when he speaks with the committee leadership and when he was asked specific questions about North Korea, to share some insights about such a visit. I believe our nation's top diplomat must be forthright, and more critically, his past sentiments do not reflect our nation's values and are not acceptable for our nation's top diplomat. I believe the American people deserve better, which is why, after carefully considering his nomination, hearing, and reviewing responses to questions I submitted for the record, I'll be casting a no vote for Director Pompeo to be our Secretary of State. We need a secretary in whom the American people trust, who understands the complexities of the threats we face. We're living in a time when old powers are asserting themselves with new tools we must master, refine, and learn how to confront. And while our nuclear posture and superior military establish our security and place in the world, our enemies are deploying new, more nimble tactics. Disinformation campaigns, covert influence, cyber warfare, systematic infiltration and manipulation of the very democratic societies that define who we are. They do not just do this with sticks, they do it with soft power. Our adversaries are using soft power diplomacy and sharp power tactics to gain influence and undermine American leadership. Simply put, the time is now to invest in these tools and in the skilled, experienced, empowered diplomats who know how to wield them. We know that we cannot confront our myriad challenges around the world if we are not present around the world. But presence is just part of the equation. Presence does not equal leadership. President Trump's campaign pledge of America First has translated into a chaotic and incoherent U.S. foreign policy that often leaves America isolated. The president sends confusing messages, often at odds with his own national security advisors. I cannot tell you how many visiting foreign dignitaries tell me that they don't know what to listen to or whom to listen to in the administration, or who is empowered to deliver the real policy guidance. The mixed messages are staggering. And while his own intelligence community confirms that Russia interfered in our 2016 election and warns of continued interference this November, the president refuses to condemn these actions. From my perspective, whether or not Russia succeeded in affecting the election is not even the question. The question is that it simply attempted to do so. And that should upset the most humble citizen to the President of the United States. And while his top military officials, unto whom he has vested so much power, insist that remaining in the Iran nuclear deal is in our national interest, the President talks about tearing it up. And just last month, the President of the United States of America was caught on tape boasting and laughing about lying to the Prime Minister of Canada. And while I was pleased to see the administration recently sanction Russian oligarchs, we still need a comprehensive strategy to counter Russian aggression and for the President to fully implement the law I helped write. They simply don't have one, as most recently evidenced by the President walking back Ambassador Haley's announcement of pending sanctions. We must show our allies that we are serious about addressing common threats, that the transatlantic alliance has been a pillar of peace and stability in the post-World War II international order that we intend to continue to stand by, that the President of the United States should vigorously defend it, embrace it, and promote it. And likewise, as a Latin Americanist, I've long held that we cannot overlook the critical relationship we have in our own hemisphere. There's no other country with whom the United States is more intricately tied by geography, by history, by culture and economy than Mexico. Yet as poverty, gang violence, and instability in Central America directly impact the security and stability of the United States, President Trump routinely denigrates our southern neighbors as drug traffickers and rapists. At a time when nimble economic statecraft and engagement are called for, he has instead mobilized American military troops on our southern border to confront the thousands of children fleeing horrific gang violence and poverty. What kind of leadership is this? Who would want us as an ally? America First is sending a signal of weakness, not of strength, to the world. It is an abdication of leadership, leaving power vacuums our rivals are happy to fill. We see rising nationalism and retrenchment in European political parties. In Latin America, we see China steadily exerting economic and cultural influence. Simply put, America First risks leaving America isolated and behind. Yes, we face a burden of leadership, but it is a joyful burden that we must embrace. And when the President of the United States seems incapable of asserting leadership and intent on undermining diplomacy to advance America's interests, we must double down and champion the values that have shaped our nation since its founding. As former Secretary Albright recently said to me in a conversation, she said, "Bob, it's Article 1 time. The Constitution made Congress a co-equal branch of government for a reason. And while no president enjoys answering to a check on their power, we must assert it now more than ever. I'll continue demanding the administration uphold the law. That means implementing the remaining sanctions of the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which the Congress passed overwhelmingly to hold Russia accountable for interfering in our elections, for developing, as well as a whole host of other elements, develop a comprehensive strategy to counter Iran, and use maximum pressure on China to exert maximum leverage on North Korea. In the Foreign Relations Committee, I've made it clear to my friend and chairman, Bob Corker, that we must not only demand nominations, we must conduct robust hearings on how the administration is diplomatically confronting threats from Russia to China to Iran. And even if my colleagues across the aisle are afraid of upsetting the president, I won't hesitate to call out potential abuses of power, like the politically motivated firing of career civil servants, or the Trump organization's possible efforts to use the presidency to grow the family business and everything from trademarks to construction deals. Because democracy will not defend itself. We must defend democracy. And at the heart of any thriving democracy is the principle of good governance. It's a value we champion around the world. We must also make it something that we champion here at home. I fear this administration's approach is telling the world that America is no longer exceptional and that our behavior should be no different than a Russia or a China pursuing power, acting transactionally, eschewing accountability. We cannot allow for such willful degradation of who we are and what we stand for. We must continue to be a leader on the global stage, driven by those values that have made us great. American leadership at home and abroad flows from our values. We're a nation of immigrants, of dreamers, of innovators, of believers in human rights and the dignity of all people. We must continue to be that beacon of light, that ray of hope to everyone in the darkest corners of the world. As we stare into this confluence of unprecedented challenges, the Trump administration has in many ways functioned like a stress test for our institutions and democratic values. And fortunately, what I see in every corner of our country is the refusal of the American people to fail that test. They are standing up for our values like never before, from the renewed activism of citizens to the record number of women running for public office, to the teenagers uniting in common cause and demanding accountability from the lawmakers in charge. The American people continue to be the greatest ambassador of our nation's character, reminding us of the sheer power of an informed democratic society living in freedom. We must hold tightly to those principles. We must vigorously champion our values, and we must cling to the democratic norms that have made it possible for the American people to overcome injustice, advance equal rights, and bend the arc of history towards progress for the past 200 years. When we champion these values, they echo far beyond our borders. They define our leadership around the world. They give us a comparative advantage. They make America exceptional. And it is in these values that inspires others to work with us, to partner with us, and to rally with us in facing down the greatest challenges of our time. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thank you very much, Senator Menendez. And I welcome Pedro Menendez, ambassador from Spain. He's a very dear friend, and I think there's a little bit of brotherhood going on here this morning. Yeah. So anyway, we're delighted to have you here, Pedro. Senator, let me, dramatic developments overnight. We've never confronted the idea before that we might be negotiating with North Korea. So as a leader for Democrats, you're the leader on foreign policy. What are the markings that you should think we should keep in mind as we walk down this road? How should we be thinking about this?
Well, I think several things. Number one is obviously a denuclearized the Korean Peninsula is a desirable goal, one that we should work hard to achieve. And I hope the administration can actually succeed in it. What I'm concerned about is, again, the thought that a meeting in and of itself without the appropriate preparations and the intense amount of work that has to go before that meeting takes place is the view that you can achieve the difficult questions there. I was concerned by Director Pompeo's answer to a question on North Korea about that our only interest is U.S. national security and homeland. I think we have allies in the region that we need to be concerned upon, Japan, for example, as a critical one. So I think if I was Prime Minister Abe, I'd be nervous if I heard that answer and say, oh, what about me? I've been a faithful ally. So I think how any potential agreement affects our allies should be a critical element of that as well. And then, you know, the question of if you're going to have a truly denuclearized Korean Peninsula, I would think that maybe the challenge of no longer having American troops there would be a question, especially if you read the president's remarks about he's given his blessing to the Koreans to ultimately figure out if they could actually end the war. Well, then what does that mean in terms of our posture, again, for our allies in the region without that type of presence there? So there are many different dimensions to this. And what is an actual, I'd like to see what the president actually thinks denuclearization fully is at the end of the day.
Senator, in many ways, this is really about China. China has always had a strategy to drive a wedge between the United States and our allies, Korea and Japan. And in many ways, this is a marvelous opportunity for the Chinese to put pressure on an ally and to push us away. How would you think we should be approaching this with China?
Well, when President Trump first came to office and he said he wasn't going to necessarily recognize the one China policy, which is the policy that Taiwan is part of China, even though we have a special relationship with China, with Taiwan through the Taiwan Relations Act. I said, wow, it's pretty significant, if that's what he does. And then when he mentioned potentially designating China as a currency manipulator, that's very significant. Sitting on the Senate Finance Committee as well, I know how the Chinese feel about that and what a significant step it would be. Those two statements were pretty remarkable. And I thought that maybe those statements were for leverage point, to get the Chinese, the one country that truly could affect North Korea's behavior because of all of the raw resources, all of the financial transactions that go through Chinese banks, and a whole host of other things. And then, all of a sudden, trademarks were given to Ivanka Trump after they had been filed for years, and we recognized the one China policy. And then after that, trademarks were given to the Trump organization that had been pending for years, and we're not going to designate China a currency manipulator. So I get concerned that when you have leverage points with China to try to change their calculation as to that North Korea should be a more significant concern for them than it is, that it's beyond having a border where people might flow and not want to have people leaving North Korea into China, that it's much more significant than that. Or the concern about the West encroaching on China's borders and its security concerns about that, that there is a way to try to get China to recalculate its position as it relates to North Korea and make it one that is more in sync with, I think, global interests. And I just think that some of those opportunities have been lost. Now, I don't know that starting a trade war with China is the way that you get their attention at the end of the day when they reciprocate and farmers in the Midwest and others in our economy will face equal challenges if all of this gets effectuated. So in my mind, there are ways to have the Chinese see that it is in their interests as well as ours, and for that fact, the international community, to work within the international order. And I know they have a concern about an international order they were not part of creating. But if we can show them that it created peace and stability for the better part of 3/4 of a century, and that they can be part of that peace and stability, then it comes down to being a strategic competitor, but not the type of challenge that we have now with China. So
are we going to have a trade war? How do you and your colleagues think about that?
Well, I think there are many ways under the existing, trade regimes that we have to try to enforce unfair practices, and those should be robustly used. I have been a big advocate of that trade agreements need to be robustly enforced, and when there are violations of it, you need to go robustly after them. And at least those create the foundation of any action you might take beyond that. That hasn't taken place here. And so, yes, do I care about China in terms of intellectual property rights as a state that has a significant amount of intellectual property being generated? Yes, I care about it very much. I think that's a real problem with China. Do I think that they have uncompetitive advantages in certain parts that affect our economy? Yes, but I think there's a different way to go about that. A trade war at the end of the day where tariffs keep getting raised on each other, that for every tariff we raise, they can raise it, And so, yes, we're one of the strongest economies in the world with a very significant consumer market, but 320 million versus a billion, you have to think about what the consequences of that when you're talking about economics at the end of the day.
Colleagues, I have so many questions. I'm going to keep asking them because I'll ask them for you here. We'll get there. JICPOA, we've got Director Pompeo has indicated in some conversations he thinks we should pull out of the nuclear agreement with Iran. Did you talk about that with him? Do you anticipate this will happen? What do you think the Senate will do?
Well, one of the things that I was looking for from Director Pompeo as the nominee for the Secretary of State is, will you be a brake on some of the president's worst instincts, meaning internally? You know, obviously the President of the United States is the commander. He's going to give you the final word, and that's the policy. And if you want to work for him, then you're going to have to execute his policy. That's understandable. But internally, are you going to be a brake on some of the president's worst instincts? Are you going to be an advocate of robust diplomacy as the first and best line of defense? Or are you going to succumb to the president's instincts that I think are challenging in terms of our national interest and security? And so the Iran nuclear deal is an example of those concerns. Now, I think everybody generally knows I robustly oppose the deal. I was the architect of most of the sanctions with others that brought Iran to the table. I felt that we fell short of the type of agreement we should have gotten. But we are where we are today. And the reality is that to walk away from the deal unilaterally without any strategy of the follow-on. So what do you do with your European allies? You know, the E3 that are part of the five that originally brought the deal together with Russia and China. What do you do with your allies? Are you going to get them to join you? They have not necessarily expressed that view, that they seek to abrogate the agreement at the end of the day. So if you don't get them with you, are you going to reinstitute the sanctions? And as someone who helped write those sanctions, and there are secondary sanctions that are affected by it, that means it would affect companies and entities within our allies. Do you expect them then, if you do that, to ultimately join you grudgingly, or will they retaliate themselves? And if you don't impose any sanctions at the end of the day, are you not a toothless tiger? So all of these are just some of the dimensions in which walking away from an agreement. Now, do I believe that we should try to engage our allies in dealing with all of Iran's nefarious activities outside of the nuclear portfolio, the missile development, the violation of the arms embargo, the destabilization of the region, still the single biggest sponsor of state terrorism? Absolutely. And that's what CATSA largely tried to do from our perspective. Getting our allies to join us in that endeavor would dramatically affect Iran, and then might put them in a position to insist, let's have meetings about the sunset issues, which are significant, and which I agree you don't wait for the sunset to actually try to deal with those issues. But you create a different environment in which you actually use the leverage that you may have. You bring our allies to engage with us outside of the nuclear portfolio. That begins to create pressure on Iran, and then you create a different environment where Iran might find it more necessary to ultimately deal with the sunset questions. So, but you have, regardless of whether it's that vision or some other, you have to have a strategy of, if you walk away unilaterally from the agreement, so what happens? What happens with our allies? What happens with the sanctions regimes? What happens with the potential consequences? What happens with Iran if at the end of the day they think that everything that they had bargained for is gone, and now they want to move forward? And then what does that mean in terms of our responses for them to move forward from their enrichment capabilities into the next phases? So this is what worries me about the lack of a strategy and an impulsiveness that just dictates that a certain date is suddenly magically, it's either do or die on that date. The May date that the president has set is just at the end of the next 6-month certification. So it seems to me that you use leverage to begin to move our allies in a different direction, but you don't just arbitrarily and capriciously leave it without any plan behind it.
Senator, 2 questions about the Western Hemisphere. We've got, overnight, we've got the news of Raul Castro stepping down. We've got a new post-Castro regime that's emerging in Cuba. And of course, they've been supporting the tragic collapse of one of the most remarkable countries, Venezuela. They've been underwriting and undergirding Maduro. This tragedy continues. Can you share your thoughts about both Venezuela and Cuba? Yes, sir, I know. We're at 3 minutes.
That might take the rest of the day, much less the 5 minutes or so. So, well, look, briefly, first of all, my perspective of that, this idea that we have a new era, a new leadership in Cuba. Raul Castro continues to be the head of the Communist Party. That's where really power is wielded inside of Cuba. So the naming of a new president is, in my mind, largely titular at best. Raul's son is the one in which you, if you want to do tourism business, which is largely one of the biggest segments of the economy, high-ranking official of the Cuban military, you want to do business inside of Cuba, you do it with his son, or you do it with his son-in-law, who is the head of the agriculture section of Cuba's economy. So the 2 main elements of Cuba's economy is run by Raul's son and his son-in-law, both high-ranking officials of the Cuban military, and at the end of the day, you don't have an economy in which people are allowed to fulfill their own capabilities, and where foreign entities that go and establish hotels or other businesses inside of Cuba can't hire a Cuban worker directly. They call the state employment agency sends them whoever they want. They get paid, they pay the regime in dollars. The Cuban workers gets paid a fraction of that in pesos. And so that type of reality isn't changing anything. And so, yeah, there may be a change in Cuba. It would be from one set of Castros to the other at the end of the day in terms of real power. And their interest in Venezuela has been, while Venezuela has been, its patron for a long time, to help prop up a command and control economy that cannot succeed on its own. And so if you go to Venezuela and you go to the airport, you're going to be screened by Cuban security agents. The Cuban security apparatus has been tremendously helpful to Maduro as it seeks to oppress its own people. And what the tragedy here is, one of the most oil-rich countries in the world actually has its people starving. And the humanitarian disaster that is unfolding is extraordinary. So I would like to see us, as we have offered legislation, to be more engaged, first of all, on the side of helping the Venezuelan people, particularly in this humanitarian context, helping those who are fleeing and helping the countries that surround them be able to help those refugees. I would like to see us talk to our Caribbean partners who vote against us at the OAS. I'm thrilled with Secretary Amargo, who is actually speaking up for the Democratic Charter, which, if it's going to mean anything at all, this is a moment in which the Democratic Charter is significant of the OAS. But we have Caribbean countries who I'm sure we have a lot of influence with and interest with, who seem to vote against us, and most importantly, the rest of the views. It's interesting to note in the recent Summit of the Americas that a series of countries said they would not recognize the elections going on in Venezuela. I like seeing that we are beginning to get hemispheric partners who are joining with us, so it is not a bilateral United States-Venezuela. It should be a hemispheric response. So there's a lot more we can do on Venezuela that ultimately, I think, could move us in a better direction than where we're
Remarkable. That was only 3 minutes, Colin. So 30 seconds just to ask. We haven't seen State Department authorization acts very recently in your world. People feel it would be an important vehicle. Just in 30 seconds, what's the prospect?
I think a state authorization is very important. When I was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, I attempted to pass one. Bob Corker was my ranking member with me, and we couldn't get there. But my view of a state authorization is that it cannot be skeletal, because at the end of the day, then that gives the primatur of things that, for example, in the reorganization, I didn't care for. that I thought was, we spent $12 million on a reorganization that just largely demoralized the State Department. So I believe in a state authorization to exert the committee's jurisdiction and create a framework that ultimately the department understands what the congressional intent is for them to carry out their mission. But that means that there has to be some robustness to it. It means that we should be authorizing budgetary elements, not just leaving that in blank to the appropriators to do, because when you budget, you are sharing your values. If we believe that human rights and democracy is important and we are budgeting for that, the department needs to carry that as part of its mission. If we believe that refugees and humanitarian assistance is important and we budget for that, then it must carry out that mission. But if you have no budgeting, if you make no authorizations, and if you don't at least create a structure of the State Department as you envision it as Congress and its Article I responsibilities, then I think what you've done is create a skeleton that just says you have an authorization, but it hasn't actually achieved some of the goals that are essential to being able to carry out U.S. foreign policy.
A remarkable tour to Horizon. Thank you so much, Senator,
Thank you
for
very
taking
much.
the time.
Pleasure to be here.
Delighted to have you here. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Really is.
Hey, Michael, could you grab that?